I moved from the suburbs into the heart of the city for work purposes. I was able to find a decent condo close to my job. It was nothing special, but the rent was surprisingly affordable and it had everything I needed. In addition, the condo was furnished, so moving in, I didn't have to bring that much stuff with me, just some boxes and supplies. My friend Seth helped me move in one evening after we'd both finished work, but were done within the hour. I showed him around the condo and then we had a few beers out on the balcony. We hadn't been there long when we heard music. It sounded scratchy and I figured someone was playing an old record player. It was coming from the balcony on the other side of the wall. Seth and I exchanged looks, but we carried on sitting there and talking over the music the best we could. As time went on, the scratchy music seemed to get louder and stranger. On the record, a woman was singing in an obscure language that I couldn't make out, and it sounded crackly, contorted. It was really eerie sounding. I didn't want to start bugging my neighbor, not when I literally just moved in, but I also didn't want to have to listen to that weird music. On that occasion, I suggested to Seth that we go out to a bar to get a few drinks. We were gone for a couple of hours, and yeah, I admit that when I arrived back at my condo, my head was a little fuzzy. By this point, as it was late, I didn't see anyone around and the complex was silent. I'd just gotten into bed when that same scratchy music started playing. It was coming from the other side of the bedroom. This riled me up as it was past midnight and was a pretty unneighborly thing to do. So fueled by anger and probably also the beer, I went out into the hallway and knocked on my neighbor's door. I could hear that music coming from within, so I knocked again, louder this time. Then suddenly, the music stopped and there was a strange silence. I decided that the neighbor must have gotten the hint about the music, so I turned around and walked back to my condo. That's when I heard a creaking sound and turned and saw the door opening. This man, I'd say about 60, thin, with a slight hunch and draped in a gray cloth, stepped out. He was holding a large cardboard box that he placed by his feet as he closed the door. I stepped toward him, but he didn't even seem to notice me. I introduced myself and politely asked if he'd mind keeping the music down. He gave me this passing cold gaze, picked up the box, and shuffled off carrying it. Not knowing what else to do, I went back into my condo and locked the door. I was too wound up to sleep, so I just laid there. Then about 20 minutes later, I heard noises coming out from the hallway. Footsteps. It sounded like someone was pacing past my front door. I reminded myself that I'd locked the door and whoever it was couldn't get in. The whole thing shook me up. The next night it happened again. It was about 1 a.m. when the scratchy music woke me up. I tried banging on the adjacent wall to get him to turn it down, but it didn't work. I just didn't want to have to go out there and confront him again since he gave me the creeps. So I pressed the pillow around my head and wished for him to turn it off soon. When he eventually did, I heard the sounds of him opening his door, shuffling along the hallway, and then a little while later, I heard the pacing footsteps outside my door. At this point, enough was enough, so I went out into the hallway to ask him what his problem was. As I opened the door, I saw him walking toward his door. I asked him if he wanted something, and he just looked at me, let out a cackled laugh, disappeared into his condo. The next day, I got talking to another neighbor in the complex. I mentioned my strange neighbor, and she gave me this knowing look and told me everyone in the building knew him as the night lurker. He never came out in the daytime, but every night, without fail, he carried a cardboard box down to the garbage chute. Everyone thought he was weird, and no one usually stayed longer than a month in my condo. This annoyed me even more. I didn't see why everyone else had to leave this complex due to one inconsiderate jerk, so the next day I made a complaint to my landlord. They said they'd contact the building maintenance and get them to talk to the guy. For 4 nights in a row, no music woke me up, and I didn't hear any late-night lurking from my neighbor. I honestly believed my complaint had done the trick. Yeah, turns out I was really wrong about that. The next night at around 1:30 a.m., that same crackly music woke me up. I was furious, so I waited for it to stop and then paused behind my front door and listened until I heard the man's door open. I darted into the hallway to see him slide his keys into his pocket and then bend down to pick the cardboard box up. There was scribbled writing all over it in black pen, but in the low light, couldn't make out what it said. I told him to please stop playing the music in the middle of the night. He looked at me without saying or doing anything, then gave me a disturbing stare and in this muffled voice said, "I know you complained about me." Then he turned and shuffled off. He may have been an old man, but he freaked me out. There was something just not quite right about him. I locked myself in my condo and waited for the pacing footsteps to come, which of course they did. I didn't try and confront that man again. I moved out the next day and went back to my folks' house. It meant I had a longer commute to work each day. Better than living next to that weirdo. I guess I found out why that condo was so affordable. But I don't know what his nightly crackly music ritual was, or what his reasons were for doing any of the weird things he did. Most of all, I don't get why he seemed to be able to get away with it. I moved into a new home out in the suburbs of New Jersey with my family. We'd viewed the house a couple of times before buying, and the neighbors seemed friendly and the area peaceful and quiet. It was exactly the type of place we wanted to raise our kids in. Moving day was a blur of madness. The moving truck came and went, and we found ourselves surrounded by a mountain of boxes. We unpacked the essentials, beds, kitchen utensils, that sort of thing. It had been a long day, so we figured the rest of the boxes could wait until the next day, so we ordered takeout, and since it was a hot evening, we ate in the backyard. After eating, my wife tidied up and I took our kids to bed. My son was 10 at the time, so he went to bed with his iPad, which he was allowed to use for 20 minutes. My daughter was only 5, so I tucked her into bed and read her a bedtime story. She seemed unsettled and was adamant there was a monster lurking under her bed. I figured she was only saying this due to the turmoil of moving. I checked under the bed, but I admit I didn't look all the way back. She seemed hesitant for me to leave, so I left her door wide open and told her she could shout to me if she needed to. I went back outside to the yard and had a drink with my wife. About an hour passed and we were discussing our course of action for tackling the unpacking the next day when our son walked out into the yard. He seemed concerned about something. We asked him what was wrong, and he said he could hear singing coming from his sister's room. He said he tried opening the door to ask her to stop, but he couldn't get the door to open. That didn't make any sense, since she always slept with the door open. There was a lock on her door that I hadn't had a chance to remove yet, but her locking herself in just made no sense. I doubted she could even reach it. I left my son with my wife and hurried up there to check on my daughter. Her room was at the top of the stairs, facing over the front of the house. I instantly saw that the door was shut, as my son said it was. I tried opening it, but it wouldn't budge. I knocked on the door, called my daughter's name, and asked if she was okay. I heard a little child sobbing coming from within the room. That's when I heard it, the singing. It sounded like a lullaby or a nursery rhyme coming from a woman's voice. The voice was definitely an adult woman's, not my daughter's. A wave of panic swept over me, and my daughter was locked in her room with some strange woman. I shouted to my daughter for her to stand away from the door, then I kicked it in. What I saw made my blood turn cold. I saw a woman about 40 years old, dressed in a floating, flowery sundress, perched on the bed and leaning over my terrified-looking daughter. She was singing the creepy lullaby as she stroked her fingers through my daughter's hair. My presence didn't seem to bother her at all. I charged over there and pulled her off my daughter and yelled at her to get out. It was only then that she seemed to notice me. She stopped singing and gave me a creepy, unhinged look before she waved at my daughter and then ran out of the room. The only doors in the house unlocked and open were the ones out to the backyard, so as I grabbed my daughter and checked she was okay, I heard screams coming from outside. I rushed out there holding my daughter and saw my wife and son looking petrified. They told me they saw a woman in a sundress that just ran past them, gave them a creepy look, and then left through the side gate. I called the police and they sent someone over to check out the area, but they found no signs of that woman. She must have gotten in the house when we left the door open to move in the boxes, or maybe she snuck in through the back door when we were outside. It makes me shudder with guilt knowing she was most likely hiding in my daughter's room when I left her there. Maybe if I'd searched under the bed properly, then I would have found her sooner. My daughter wasn't harmed. She said she woke up to that woman singing to her and playing with her hair. I'm relieved my son heard the singing when he did. Can't bear thinking about what could have happened if he didn't. We ramped up the security after that, but none of us felt safe in the house. We sold it about a year later, and we feel a lot safer now that we're in a new house, one far away from that creepy woman in the sundress. I was going through a complicated breakup and having to stay on my friend's couch. It wasn't ideal, and I was really yearning to get away and reset my life. One day, my aunt called me and told me the tenant in the house she owned had just moved out, and I could stay there as long as I wanted. The house in question was a beach house in Malibu. He was offering it to me rent-free. I just had to pay the utility bills, so at the time it sounded perfect. A couple of days later, I flew out there. The beach house was in a secluded area with its own section of private beach that only mine and about 5 other beach houses could use. When I arrived, it was getting late, so I just wanted to get inside and go to sleep. My aunt told me the cleaners had left the keys under a potted plant, but when I checked, no keys were there. I was getting a bit stressed about this since I didn't want to be locked out all night. I tried the door and, to my surprise, it was unlocked. I switched the lights on, found the keys on the breakfast bar, and assumed the cleaner had been distracted by something and forgotten to lock up. Like I said, I was tired, so I poured myself a glass of water and went to bed. It didn't take me long to fall asleep. I woke up the next morning and noticed that the glass of water I'd brought up last night and put on the nightstand no longer there. I swear I hadn't moved it, but I blamed it on my exhaustion from the night before. The day was full of errands. I was rushing around so much that I didn't get a chance to do anything else. That evening, I had an early night and once again took a glass of water with me to bed. The next morning when I awoke, the glass again was gone from my nightstand. I looked around the entire house, but I couldn't find it. I started to think I was losing it before concluding that I was overdoing it and just needed to relax. The next day, I decided to spend the day unwinding on the beach. I was on a lounger reading a book when this little girl from one of the nearby beach houses came over to me and showed me her unicorn floaty. I noticed her look over at my house and wave up at the window. I asked who she was waving at. She giggled and told me she was waving at George. I peered up at my bedroom window and saw the blinds sway as if someone had just been peering through it. The window wasn't open or anything, and I'd turned the air conditioning off upstairs, so it made no sense for the blinds to be moving, unless someone was in there. I had this gut feeling that something wasn't right, so I asked the girl's dad if he'd mind taking a look inside for me. He seemed to find this request strange and told me that I should get my partner to look, and then he pointed over at my house. There, standing in my bedroom window, was a man in a dark jacket and hat, and he was staring over at me. I explained that I didn't know who that man was, but whoever he was an intruder. I then called the police. The girl's father said he looked a lot like George, the man who previously lived there, but he couldn't be sure because of the hat. He didn't want to wait with me and scare his daughter, so I had to wait outside alone for the police to arrive. Waiting there was terrifying. I didn't know if that man would suddenly appear or what he was capable of. The police showed up about 15 minutes later. They searched the house and led that man out in handcuffs. He didn't resist or struggle. He just looked at me with a troubling smile. In addition to the intruder, the police found some of his personal items in the spare bedroom under the bed. A backpack full of weapons, although they didn't specify what kind, and 2 glasses containing water. I found out later this man was named George, and he was the previous tenant of the beach house. My aunt had evicted him for not paying his rent. He must have taken the keys from under the plant pot and decided to become a squatter and stay there rent-free, unbeknownst to anyone, especially my aunt. I don't know what would have happened to me if I'd continued to stay there, unaware that George was in there with me. How many glasses would he have taken before he got bored of that and decided to do something much worse, or even use the weapons in his backpack on me? I really dodged a bullet. Not something that I really want to think about.